Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Nowhere else could he remember seeing anything like that. The unambiguous warning in a language he didn't recognize, yet understood perfectly, was all he could think of anymore. There was a time before he first read the words, there must have been. Or maybe he convinced himself of that in an attempt to feel like there was a time different from now. A single thing that was different. That thought used to entice the smallest smile from him. Or maybe he convinced himself of that. He counted his fingers and had 10. The same number as his toes. He had 2 arms and 2 legs. All connected by a large mass in the middle where his abdomen was, and above it with no exact beginning or end, his torso from which his neck sprouted. And he could name each part of himself without remembering why or when or how he learnt those words. Or any words, really. That was the language he knew. The language of the words hinted that there must have been other languages. He was sure he didn't know any other than his own, and he couldn't think of any other language either. Did he invent his own language? Could he differentiate between his own and? No, there was no language that wasn't his own. If he ever learned it, it would become his own. How can one not have something they own? Or own something they didn't have? No. There were only 2 languages. If there was anything capable of knowing a language, it too would surely have its own, 3rd language. The words felt alive, having their own language. The only thing in this place other than himself. He checked again and he found that, indeed, he still had 10 fingers. 5 on each arm. And 10 toes, 5 on each leg. And only 2 legs, and no less than 2 arms, and in the center, the abdomen and the torso. He could feel his neck and his head sat neatly on top of it, like some repurposed stump. For as long as he could remember, he dreaded passing close to the silent warning, never being sure if he should move just a bit further away. Yet, he couldn't leave it. He could, hypothetically, go as far from it as he pleased. But for every additional length of his body from the words, the darkness would grow thicker. Out there were shapes he didn't recognize, things he could never know the purpose of. He pondered on them, prodded them, examined them, turning them to face the light so he could glean something about the object of his temporary fascination. Never did he leave a place with insight he hadn't arrived with already. He preferred to stay close enough to the warning where the light would not be directly obscured by all the unknowables. No 2 shapes were similar. He'd examined each one he could see with enough clarity. Some time ago he moved them all to one side so the light would reach deeper into darkness, and he checked those shapes as well. In fact, it wasn't the first time he did that, every time delving deeper into the crowded mass. But the last time would be his last time. As the shapes moved, they would bump into each other, changing each other's paths. The deeper he went, the harder it was to keep the clearing from closing up behind him. Last time he feared he would not be able to come back in time before he lost sight of the light. He was right, but he managed to find it again. The darkness was not to be explored, only embraced, and he could not bring himself to bear it. And even after all of that, the shapes were so incomparably different that their uniqueness was the only thing they shared. That made them hard to remember for long. Maybe if he took enough looks at them, he could memorize them. He looked at the one closest to him, but it must have been completely new, drifted from somewhere deep within the darkness where he hadn't looked before. He realized the silent tide had scrambled a better part of the mass. Maybe the old ones switched places with them. Maybe he should check. And with that thought, he moved the shape closest to him. Was the warning a description of this place, or was it talking about some unseen door? What is beyond the endless sea of shadows? Were there other words, other lights? He would not dare leave the light and forget how to find his way back. Fear is stronger than curiosity, and never did he leave a place with insight he hadn't arrived with already. If there was anyone else, they must have been beyond the shadows or beyond the word. Either way, there must have been others at some point in the past. Or maybe he convinced himself of that. He had approached the words closer than his comfort would allow. Sometimes by accident, sometimes with purpose. He could not detect the door, but it must have been there. He wanted to find it, to catch even the smallest glimpse of it. And every time the door would remain hidden completely. And every time he'd end up reading the words again. And every time the words would mock him and his foolish attempt. And he would indeed abandon the attempt, in fear of triggering some greater truth behind the warning. And every time, just like this time, he convinced himself the words couldn't win if he just tried again. The warning was void as long as he kept trying, as long as he would return each time he turned back. They weren't true if he still had hope. And if they weren't true, then they weren't the description of this place. And if they weren't that, then they were indeed describing some entrance he simply hadn't been lucky or brave enough to discover yet. He moved as slow as he possibly could. When he came so close that the letters seemed the largest they've ever appeared and the light felt lighter than it's ever been, a familiar feeling came over him. Fear that, if there is a door, and he doesn't see it, then he wouldn't know if he'd accidentally entered it. The words seemed daunting once again. He'd gone too far. He might have even offended the words just by coming this close, teasing this lonely warning, spurring it to do something. Hurling back, his breath shaky, his forehead sweaty, he hid behind one of the larger shapes. He should stay there for a long time. Maybe that will be penance enough, hidden from the light in voluntary exile. No, he will stay there even longer. He hadn't seen the door this time. The words that guarded the invisible entrance were everything. They were the only thing he could ever recognize. All the questions stemmed from the words. They were the only possible honesty he had, and the only possible lie. If they guarded a door to some greater suffering, then why was he drawn to them? If the only possible hope lay as far away from the words as he could imagine moving, then why was the seemingly endless darkness such an infinitely more frightening thought? Maybe, no, surely, fear is stronger than curiosity. This must be a prison. Any prison can surely be broken out of, given enough attempts. Except if the warden is smarter than you can ever hope to become. Can one be both a warden and a prisoner? If so, then he surely was one. His cell was light-sized. The bars were all around him, endlessly shifting, perfectly containing his entire cell, no matter its size. And there was a guard that would likely punish him if loitered around, if he came too close, if he forgot his place. There was only one rule, and yet no other rule was needed. Yes, this was the perfect prison. But how can he be sure he could never escape if he doesn't try? There was hope, and the guard was a liar, and the rule was easily broken. And what's the point of having bars that don't bar you from going anywhere? Unless their purpose was to bar you from yourself. And the guard was the only friend you had. And the cell is really only as big as you're willing to move around, and he wasn't willing to move very far. It feels like a prison. Yet, nothing bad is happening. Isn't imprisonment a form of imposed sentence for some transgression? But what was the point of such a prison other than to create resentment in its prisoners? No, it must be a prison because this is the only place where it's safe to place the prisoner. Was he a prisoner? If so, he should try to break out. Unless this wasn't a prison. Must it always be so? Is this everything he will ever know? In a way, he already knows everything he could possibly know. Nothing ever changed on its own, and nothing he could bring himself to do would ever change anything about anything. Surely not if he can imagine all these things he could not get an answer to. He could count his toes backwards and shift the massive shapes around. He could approach the words, seek the door, or move out into the darkness. He was certain he could get lost deep in the dark. He had choices, and those choices had consequences. Even just moving ever so slightly in one direction would be ever so slightly different than staying in that position. There was change, yes. But what does the change mean, if any, and all change is meaningless? All the shapes were unique, but in a sense there was even less meaning in them because of it. If he found two identical shapes, even just two identical features, that would be an interesting change. It would mean something, surely. And if they were all identical, he could ponder the meaning of their particular shape and size. But he couldn't count them as easily, nor could he tell whether any new shapes drifted closer to the light or whether old ones disappeared into the dark forever. It seems he cannot truly imagine any meaningful change whatsoever. Except by walking through the door. Or into the infinite darkness. But fear is stronger than curiosity. It has always been so. Or maybe he convinced himself of that. Then fingers. The mass shifted again and he moved a little, avoiding a massive passing shape. A shiver passed down his spine and he instinctively moved further back from the light. He'd come closer than he was prepared to. Yes, this must be a prison. There was a feeling he had these thoughts so many times that it tortured him to think about them again. Compared to that, the warning words almost seemed benevolent at times, and now was one of those. That unambiguous warning in a language he didn't recognize, yet understood perfectly, was all he could think of anymore.